Bismillahirrahmanirrahim and Assalamu alaikum, and a very warm welcome to my virtual class. I'm Safia Sultan, your online history instructor for class 8s. Hope my this video finds you happy, healthy, and in a very good shape. The hand that wrote a page built a city. A very small quote with a very deep meaning. Children, simply you need to understand that whatever we do, we are accountable of it at any cost and any part of life. So whatever we do, we have to keep in mind that the impact of it is deep and positive for others, because you don't know what consequence it's going to leave on others. So be very responsible every time, all the time. Yes. Before we start discussion and I start my lesson, children, it's really important to have a look at this checklist slide. Are you alert? Are you ready to receive what I am giving you today in the form of information? Second, you should have your booklets with you to copy the important points. Textbook definitely should be there here on your table so that you can refer to the textbook anytime whilst listening to the video, and you can stop the video and check the textbook. And definitely stationery is a must. You should be having your notebook, your pen, everything ready to take the notes. Children, we have already started discussing about the topic, which is Hindu Muslim unity, and this is the second lesson to discuss further events which took place in this regard. Yes, it's always appropriate to start a lesson with a small recap. So let's start it with a recap. Okay, your screen says Minto Morley reforms. I am sure you must be amazed because Minto Morley reform is not a recent learning you have done. You have done it in your last term. And then why I am trying to revise this concept again here. Children, the reason is actually today also we are going to talk about some other reforms, not Minto Morley reforms, the other reforms which were presented after the Minto Morley reforms, exactly after 10 years. So, actually, before we talk about present reforms, we need to get to know about the reaction of the Indians when they had those previous reforms. So, if you see on your screens, the Minto Morley reforms were introduced in 1909, but they couldn't satisfy the Indian people, and Indian people even disliked them in 1909. They had certain concerns and they did not like the idea of the British, which was presented to them in the form of Minto Morley reforms. Immediate lesson, in the last lesson we discussed about the Lucknow Pact, which is seriously a very very important event in the history of India, where for the first time Muslim League and Congress sat together. They forgot their differences and they decided that now from on like from 1916 and onwards, the two communities are going to work together and they are going to try pressurize the British to give them self rule. Or, in other words, you can say that the Lucknow Pact or the Lucknow meeting provided uh, a created a working relationship between the Congress and Muslim League. So, yes, now it's time to discuss the objectives for today's lesson. As I told you, children, we are talking about another set of reforms. So, today we are going to analyze the significance of the Montfort reforms. And then we are going to evaluate whether these reforms were workable, whether the Indians liked them or not, or they rejected them. So you can see the picture of the two people, Montague and Chelmsford, who were the ones who designed these reforms. One is the Secretary of State of India, and the other was the Viceroy. Okay, so let's start talking about the content of the reform to get to know about whether the Indians liked them or not. So, if I talk about the structure of the council, they decided that council of the state will comprise of 8 to 12 people, and three of which should be Indians and should have spent 10 years in India. So you can easily say that British are now trying to bring more completely local Indians as the main face. Then central legislature was increased and made into two houses, legislative assembly and upper house. One has 144 members and the other has only 60 members. Now, one new thing introduced in the reforms of 1919 was the system of diarchy. Children's system of diarchy was introduced actually on the provincial level, and if I explain you, it was simply a way British designed to divide the power between the British and the Indians. Again, I'm repeating, it was not given on the viceroy's level, it was only provided on the provincial levels. Like each province will have certain fields where they can work and decide and do things on their own. I mean, power will be in the hands of the Indians. And now, if I talk about the fields where Indians can do things, it was education, agriculture, health, self government, and public works. I'll explain it to you here in this way that if a provincial government wants to do something in the field of agriculture, they can do it on their own. They are not much dependent on British to decide something. This is what they said in diarchy, that they are going to divide the fields of work between the British and the Indians. So some fields will go to the British, say in the central government, and some fields will remain with the provincial government. And I have just discussed about the fields of the provincial government. Then they allowed more people to vote in India. You know, previously it was not the case as we have today. Today we have only one restriction, that if a person is 18 years old, he or she can vote. But previously there were several things which were noticed, whether the person is educated or not, uh, paying the tax or not. So these things, so now they extended this circle and they allowed more people to vote. Then, British hold, as I just told you about the system of diarchy, which allowed to divide the fields of power between the British and the Indians. In the previous slide, if I go back, we discussed that the Indians were having a hold on education, agriculture, health, local self government, and public works. And on the other hand, what were the things or what were the fields which were kept by the British? If we talk, they were military, currency, communication, and criminal laws. So, simply if you understand diarchy, I'll explain it to you again to make it very clear. Simply, if there is anything, any decision to be taken about military, only viceroy and his team will take that decision. And if it is anything related to, you know, agriculture or public works, the province can decide on their own within the Indians. There is no need for the British intervention in this regard. So British tried to give somehow power to the local Indians. Some seats were reserved for religious groups like Muslims, Sikhs, and Indian Christians. That is actually, you can call them the recognition of the minorities. So somehow minorities, they thought that it will please the minorities that the seats were reserved for them. But still, the big question mark is diarchy, because British thought that the system of diarchy will definitely please the Indians because they are definitely giving some power to the Indians. But now what we have to see is whether diarchy was actually giving power to the Indians or not. So, what does this slide tell you? Rejection of the reforms of 1919. So, one thing is very, very clear, and that is Indian people did not like the reforms. Now we have to actually discuss about what made Indian people reject the reforms. And you know, the most important thing which was rejected by the British was the system of diarchy. Okay, so if I talk about the first thing, why it happened. See, the first problem is that British were giving power to the Indians on trial basis. Number one. And if when the Indians get into the details of these reforms, they get to know that actual power will still remain in the hands of British. How it will happen? Because whatever Indians want to do, Definitely they need funds for it. And when they go and get try to get the funds are going to be allocated by the British authorities. So what is in their hands actually? If you think about it, if you bring all this scenario in your mind, okay, Indians are given power in the field of education. Now Indians can decide whatever they want to do in the field of education. But when it comes to an Indian minister deciding that they want to make 10 schools in their province, who's going to fund those schools? Ultimately, in the end, funding is in the hands of the British. So this was the reason why system of diarchy was very, confusing. In some cases it was not very clear also, and Indians thought that they don't want power in this way. Yes, power still lied in the British hands. And as a result, the first thing which happened was Indian National Congress withdrew from the elections. The first thing was they said that we don't want to fight any elections which are conducted under the reforms of 1919. Diarchy was absolutely rejected, and the main reason of this rejection was, okay, some fields were given to the Indians, but ultimately funds were within the hands of British. Anglo Christian education was still with the center. That was a very confusing thing, because if education is with the Indians, so why Anglo Christian education is still with British? So there were few fields where there was confusion. Hindu and Muslims both opposed the British reforms. It was not the case that only Hindus are going against it or only Muslims are going against it. You can easily say that at this point, after the Lucknow Pact, they are together and they both opposed the British reforms. And this resulted in unrest and disturbance in Punjab due to the Montfort reforms. People of Punjab came out. In this scenario, children, I just want to remind you about one more thing. This year, when we have the Montfort reforms, actually is 1919. World War One has just ended, and British are the victors of the war. Do you remember British made some promise with the Indians when they wanted help? Yes. What was that promise, if you remember? Very good. I can see many of you remember, and that's a very good sign. I'm really happy, children. And I appreciate all those who remember. Yes, British made a promise to the Indians that if Indians help them in the war, British in return will give them self rule after the war. Now, once these reforms come after the war, you can easily understand that Indians were expecting a lot from these reforms. They thought that these reforms will definitely talk about self rule. And when they deeply checked these reforms, they couldn't find anything related to self rule. Only diarchy was there, and which was again not a very much acceptable thing for the Indians. Unrest was there, so this led to the establishment of a new bill by the British. And what was that bill? That is what we are going to discuss now. This bill was the Rowlatt Act of 1919. Now, what happened in this Rowlatt Act is what we have to discuss. To control a revolution that emerged in Punjab, Bengal, and Bombay, freedom was restrained, and this Rowlatt Act allowed the imprisonment of anyone who is responsible for doing a political offense. May it be talking against the government, may it be writing against the government, may it be provoking people against the government. These are all political offenses. So Rowlatt Act stated that if a person is involved and caught doing a political offense, children, I'm again repeating what is political offense: doing something against the government, writing against the government, provoking people against the government, being a part of agitating agitations and movements. That is all political offense. Anything which people do which is all against the government is a political offense. And Rowlatt Act clearly stated that if a person is involved in a political offense, they will be immediately imprisoned and immediately jailed without any right of trial. And you know, this is the denial of the basic human right. You cannot call anyone guilty until you prove them. So British took this basic human right from them, and then they expected the Indians to be peaceful. In this scenario, no political movements were permissible. People could not gather, they could not, you know, raise their voice against the government. This was all happening. Now, definitely, if there is something like roller act, which is curbing the basic human right, which is the right of proving themselves innocent. So, definitely, Indian people were very, very angry. And if you see here, Gandhi immediately showed a strong opposition towards the Rowlatt Act, and he said that it is absolutely denial of the human rights. And even Jinnah resigned from the Imperial Legislative Council as a sign of protest. Again, you can see that the Hindus and Muslims are united here. They were doing things in the same direction, they were going in the same direction. Both of them were against the Rowlatt Act. Okay, children, so it's time now to sum up the learning, today's learning. So, if we see, the first thing we did today was the Montfort reforms, which were introduced by the British in 1919, and we discussed that they were introduced in India just after the end of the war, when Indians were expecting something which is equivalent to self rule. And in this scenario, British brought the Montfort reforms, and they tried to give some power to the local Indians in the form of the system of diarchy. Some subjects were reserved with the British, and some subjects, or you can say some fields, were transferred to the Indians. But unfortunately, Indians were not given the sole power to handle the matters of these fields. And that is the reason Indians did not like the system of diarchy. And since diarchy was the main essence of the Montfort reforms, so if the Indians do not like diarchy, it means that they did not like the Montfort reforms. Second thing we discussed was the Rowlatt Act. Rowlatt Act was presented to it was actually presented to scare the people, scare them from being arrested, scare them from thinking that they won't be getting any right of trial. But do you think acts like Rowlatt Act can suppress the feelings of the people, or you think that people get more angry and they rise with more energy? That is what we have to discuss and get to know in the next class. And then we discussed that Jinnah and Gandhi, both being together, rejected the uh, Rowlatt Act, and somehow they showed their anger towards it. So, children, hope today's things are all clear. Whatever we have done, it's reflection time. So, with this lesson, you will be finding a Padlet link where I would like you to share your opinion, and I would love to read them. So, that's the end of my class. And inshallah, next week we will again meet and we will try to know that do you like by that time we will try to explore that the acts like roll attack, can they really stop the people from protesting? Do you think the people were scared of the roll attack and they stayed at home, or they came out with more power? That is what we will learn in the next week, children. So till then, take special care of yourself. Allah Hafiz.